Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for People Plus Places. I'm Adrian Scott. I'm the President and CEO for the Los Angeles Conservancy, and we're happy to have you here today. Again, this is People Plus Places, Revisiting Resilient Bunker Hill, People, Housing, and the Legacy of Displacement. So thank you for joining us. The Conservancy's People Plus Places series is all about people-focused heritage conservation efforts and us sharing their stories. And increasingly, we're working to offer these programs on a monthly basis. So please feel free to reach out to us if you have ideas or you would like to take part in a future People Plus Places. While these programs are open to all, we also encourage you to join our 4,500 plus members for an even more accessible to our programs and events and our recently launched new member publication called Landmark. Our next People Plus Places will be on November 12th, where we'll be featuring Judson Studios, the oldest family-run stained glass company in America. We'll be learning about their story and decorative stained glass, taking an interactive online tour of their current works in progress, and also talk about some of the LA's most iconic places that feature work from Judson Studios. So please stay tuned for that and join us on November 12th. And today we're talking all about Bunker Hill. In some ways, a lost LA neighborhood that was redeveloped and remade into what it is today during urban renewal of the late 1950s, 60s, and early 1970s. Today, it still lives on through memories, film, remnants, and in some ways folklore that isn't always accurate in telling the full story. And today is also about putting forward another perspective and telling more of the full story that includes the people that once lived there and the innovative Bunker Hill Refrain project that's using emerging technology and history to bring this story to life. And lastly, this is fundamentally a personal human story about loss, displacement, erasure, and descendants that involves many different perspectives and lived experiences. So for the next hour, we're going to have a conversation. There's an opportunity for you all to be able to ask questions, interact with the panel and folks that we have joining this People Plus Places today. I would encourage you at any time during the program to enter your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen of the Zoom, and we'll try to get to all those as soon as possible. And with that, I'm going to turn it over and introduce you to Lindsay McCahey, who is our neighborhood outreach coordinator and has a little bit more experience with this project from when she was at USC, but she's going to introduce some of our friends joining us today from the Bunker Hill Refrain project. So Lindsay.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here and really excited to introduce our three panelists, starting first with Meredith Great-Graytan, who's a planning historian whose work illuminates the rhetorical practices of urban planners and the consequences of those practices for cities and the people that live in them. She serves as Associate Dean of the Graduate School at USC and is an adjunct associate professor in the Price School of Public Policy and the School of Architecture, where she teaches truly fantastic classes on planning, urban design, and heritage conservation. I'm lucky to have been a student of hers. And most importantly for today, she's the founder and co-director of Bunker Hill Refrain. So thanks, Meredith, for joining us. Next up, we have Matt Borges, who's a technical designer and developer for immersive cultural heritage projects. He is currently the assistant director of the Amundsen Lab at USC, and he also operates Cerebral Lighting Solutions, LLC, an immersive media consulting firm. And last but not least, we have Eliza Jane Franklin, who is a master's student in her last semester of the Heritage Conservation Program at USC. She's a student researcher who, for this project, was assigned a family of individuals, the Baez from 242 Figueroa Street, and attempted to reconstruct their identities. So we're excited to hear more about that through this program. I think we're going to turn it over to Meredith first to give us an overview and really welcome us into the world of Bunker Hill Refrain.
Thank you. And thank you. It's good to be here with all of you. Before we really get started, I do want to start with a couple of acknowledgements. First and foremost, we have community partners in the Los Angeles Public Libraries, Octavia Lab specifically. Also, the USC libraries have been partners all the way through this project. I'm incredibly grateful to USC brilliant students, especially those from the Masters of Heritage Conservation program who've been with us and helped shape this project all the way through. And then most importantly, I do really want to acknowledge the former residents, descendants, and community historians who've kept this story alive for many, many years. And so we're incredibly grateful to all of the work that has preceded us. And I absolutely believe that we are standing on the shoulders of giants. And so for all of the folks who are still part of the Bunker Hill community, I want to at least acknowledge them. So our project, it currently has 3 parts, and those 3 individual pieces will eventually come together and become one. So at the moment, the 3 parts are building a digital model of the Bunker Hill neighborhood before demolition, so before 1950s. We're also visualizing data from a housing survey that was collected by the Works Progress Administration for the LA Housing Authority in 1939. And we're working with former residents and their descendants to tell kind of new stories and link back the people history to the actual project as a whole. And so eventually this larger project with 3 different strands will come together. And I'm going to actually sort of ping it over to Matt's first off, because Matt's will actually talk us through the digital model piece. And then Eliza will talk us through some of her work with the descendants. And then I'll come back at the end and talk about the visualizing data and a little bit more about what we've learned in the last few years as we've been working on this. So Matt, over to you.
Okie dokie. So we have constructed a model, a 3D model of a large section of Bunker Hill that I'm going to show you a little flyover video of right here. So this is an ongoing project that has been in the works for the last few years. These buildings were modeled by students from all over USC, including architecture, the Iovine and Young School, cinematic arts, and they have taken a number of sources like old architectural drawings, aerial photos, photos from the ground, and Sanborn maps, a number of different sources, and use them to reconstruct these buildings. And this flyover shows you like a good like amount of what we have worked on, but I also want to show that progress is not linear, in that we have, for a number of reasons, had to actually rebuild a number of the buildings, actually all of the buildings, because originally we had used architectural drawings and we had built them in SketchUp, which is an architecture software. So for a number of technical reasons, to be able to optimize this and be able to get it to something that could get on the web, we had to rebuild the buildings. So I'm going to show off in Unity here. This is a view of where we're at currently. So a number of things are in the works, choosing the exact colors for the buildings, most of which we only have black and white photos for. Working on the roads, the sidewalks, putting those lamps back in. The vegetation, you can see the color on all of these buildings up here. Hasn't been filled in yet. These ones we're still tweaking, still looking for the exact kinds of references that we can use. And parts of the city like the tunnel wall with the steps back here, those are still in progress. Most things here are actually in progress. So you can see it's kind of this like iterative rebuilding process, which is, yeah, absolutely not linear at all. So this is a model that is meant to be versatile. We have worked for literally years on optimizing it to the smallest possible file size. Really, it has been like just this tremendous like effort, a humongous mountain of work to take what used to be this neighborhood in a size that would like slow down a very powerful computer and shrinking it to the point where hopefully soon you'll be able to actually like engage with this model on a smartphone, maybe over the web, right? So we're building this in Unity, which if you don't know is a video game development technology. The buildings are being modeled in Blender, which is a 3D modeling software usually used in games or animation. We have worked with students to make most of the buildings. And the thing about working with students is that the turnover rate is so high. It is crazy because they are extremely like talented students, right? And so they usually like will work for a little bit and then someone else will pick them up, you know, like some company will hire them like right off our hands while they're still students. And so part of this whole effort has been working on a way to like quickly onboard and work with students to get them modeling quickly. So I want to show just really quickly a 3D modeling guide that we've worked on, which includes everything from an introduction to the neighborhood to the exact coverage of where we are building, where we're not, mapping things out. We go over the level of detail that we're trying to capture, which is not complete. We're not intending to make this photorealistic because it's not feasible technically for our goals of putting it on the web. And we have examples for our students of what the buildings can look like, right? You can see here, do not include this, do not include that, include this, don't include that. Including because some things are added in Unity and some things are done in Blender, right? So big, long process, lots of snags, but we are still working. Once we have a fair amount of this done, it'll make it that much easier for us to really explore the freedom that making this in a video game engine gives us, which is really tremendous. Like we are able to make an interactive experience for this that is really comprehensive. It really gives us a massive amount of freedom with what is the experience that we can give to the users, to the level of a video game, right? We're currently talking and thinking through what is the exact interaction, and Meredith can talk a bit more about this later, but there are several interfaces that we've experimented with already and several more that we're talking through. So back to you, Meredith.
Thank you. And that's a really great segue to Eliza Jane, who is going to talk us through how the history fits into this model. Eliza, if you're free, hand it over to you. Eliza, I'm not sure. Are you there with us? You're on mute.
Yes, I'm here. It was
Fabulous.
a
Great.
bit of a tech pause. So my name again is Eliza, and so in January of this year,
Eliza, you're muted.
must have muted itself. It's a tech issue, sorry. As a graduate student in the Masters of Heritage Conservation program. I joined her class really eager to learn. And after a brief overview of the historical significance of Bunker Hill as not only a geographical location, but as a hub of social activity, we, and by we, I mean the class, we quickly realized that Professor Meredith and everyone already involved with the Bunker Hill project um, really, recognized that this was a special place and a home, right, to several families. And so this notion of preservation versus public history is a question that arises in consideration of how to go about preserving this locality, its collective memory, and overall cultural heritage of the space, right? And it's a great case study for future generations to reflect on things such as housing alternatives, um, and such. And so we all know the politically motivated destruction of Bunker Hill resulted in the clearing of the land for private and public development. And the project of Bunker Hill was, right, and is the longest running redevelopment project in Los Angeles history. And so, as part of our class, the goal was to research and document in hopes that any of this collected information could be used to preserve and placed in utilizing the XR technology that Mats has just demonstrated and the overall digital database for Bunker Hill. And so, based off of 1940 census records, which I will um, share one, uh, based off of this particular census record, this is where we started. And if you can see, everyone else has been redacted but these three individuals. And I was assigned household 4 with Jimenez Valles. And I want to highlight that there's this shroud of darkness that is often associated with Bunker Hill. And it was a place riddled with tragedy, but it's readily decipherable for people who are willing and ready to really delve into who were these individuals. And the whole purpose of this project was really to focus to humanize these individuals and the inhabitants of Bunker Hill who were readily erased from their geographies and rendered undecipherable. And so the home that I had, the individuals were Nora, Zalima, and Juan. And simply stated, Nora Valles was the sister to Zalima and the sister-in-law to Juan Jimenez. Their small apartment was shared at 240 South Figueroa. She was born in 1923 in the state of Chihuahua, Mexico. Her father, David Valles, he was also a resident of 240 Bunker Hill, and her mother, Aurelia, had deep roots in Chihuahua. Um, so pretty much their entire family had a connection to this building. Um, and through this document, further research was done. And so we were able to build out not just their background in this building, but how they progressed as a family. And Nora and Alejandro wound up having one daughter, Irene Guco. They lived at 240 North Figueroa until about 1954. All of this information that I am sharing with you, I'm going to stop that share. All of this information was gathered through Ancestry and other digital sources. And so, with that being said, AI is now a tool that is embedded in Ancestry. And this technology really made it much more faster. Things were a lot more efficient. And all of this was then taken and then inserted into the imagery for the XR technology for the building at 240 Figueroa. And it was an experience in which people are now taken from the positionality of being a voyeur to actually being a participant, right? Someone who's able to engage with these individuals and humanize them. And a demonstration was conducted at the Vision and Voices event held at USC campus. And this allowed a lot of individuals to, including myself and other general public individuals, to really engage and see how this works firsthand. Lastly, at the end of the quarter, we were tasked with creating meaningful projects that reflected our depth of knowledge and experience through the course, utilizing all of this information that I gathered around the Values family um, and their time at 240 South Figueroa. I took these historical records and I looked to their matriarch, who unfortunately passed away before she was able to reside in this building. But it's this idea that families, especially families who are that close knit, the impact of a mother. And I was just curious as to what the outputs would be, right? And so I chose to create an obituary because she remained in their hearts and she's deeply embedded. And so the prompt, I basically took all the information that was gathered from documents that we had, and I created an image, right, of her in her youth and her also in adulthood. And the interesting thing is that it came out looking like her children, right, who inhabited 240 South Figueroa. So this idea of we're able to at least feel like we're connected to these purposes. And so moving forward, I want to end with the possibilities are endless for this technology, right? To advance the field of preservation and not only bridge a multitude of demographic gaps, but geographical gaps. So often each of our disciplines, they operate in these silos, right? However, XR technology really gives us the capability to begin to use it as a tool of policy advocacy, specifically for housing, planning, and the field of preservation. And others who may not be familiar with this technical language or possess the skill now are able to utilize it because it's user friendly. And so this makes me excited about the future of preservation and our ability to be able to advocate as a community. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Eliza. So much appreciated. Matt, can I turn it over to you? Can you run the 240 Figueroa video? Because I think we'll show that, because that's going to give folks a sense of how we're hoping to stitch all of this together with the building of the digital model, the sort of deep history that we're doing with using Ancestry, and our experts, the genealogical experts, and also thinking about this survey as well. So if you run that, I'm going to talk a little bit while you do that about what happens when you actually start to pull this together and new questions that emerge when you do it. So if Matt, if you could do that one, great.
Okay.
Right. So as Eliza said, one of the first things we tried to do was test out our merging of history and technology in an exhibition. So we chose 240 Figueroa because it's an apartment building that had many different individuals living in it. And what you're looking at on the screen is our sort of first attempt to merge the history with the technology. And what you do is you can click on a window, and by clicking on that window, then the research that was conducted by USC students kind of pops up. A couple of things we learned as we did this. One of the interesting things is, I don't know about the rest of you, but this always makes me feel a little Peeping Tom-ish. So one of the things that happens when you actually start putting things together is you learn how you want to interact with the technology. And one of the things that we are doing now is thinking about the avatars that are embedded in these digital models, rather than us looking at them through their windows in this sort of slightly odd way. What we're going to do is we're going to have the avatars actually call people in. So we're going to have figures standing on their on their balconies, asking people to join them in a conversation. So if there was one of the things that we learned on the tech side of doing these kinds of projects is there's an ethics to the avatars. And so we're really thinking now about how do we actually have meaningful conversations with this technology and ask new kinds of questions that come out. Another thing we also learned when we sort of pulled it together was the incredible power of lighting. This has sort of a noir feeling to it. And one of the things that we really want to do with this project is, we can probably stop it now. We can probably, we really want to change the lighting so that it's dawn, so that it's daylight, because we're trying to change a little bit of the narrative of Bunker Hill. We acknowledge the noir history, but we wanted to really emphasize the everyday lived reality of this particular place. So Eliza's sort of historical research and the research that students are doing merged with the new technology is kind of bringing to the fore new questions about the social life of the individuals who are there, and also the technology about how you actually visualize a neighborhood, as something that's moving and changing and alive, and having all sorts of different aspects to it. So that's kind of a broad overview of where we are, building on the modeling, building on the historical research, and there are a number of lessons that have emerged. One's the technical side, of course, but we're also learning lots about the actual individuals themselves. There's an estimation, the official records suggest that 8,000 people were displaced. It's highly likely that significantly more than 8,000 people were displaced. And one of the things that we're learning about is sort of networks and kinship that existed on Bunker Hill. There are lots of families who are living in different houses, but all kind of on the neighborhood. We're also learning about the role of the individuals on Bunker Hill as part of the downtown workforce. They were folks who worked in the cafes, they went and shopped at Grand Central Market, all of these sort of everyday social things that were erased when the actual buildings came down. So I think we're going to switch it back to our LA Conservancy colleagues to sort of talk about questions, and we're happy to answer questions from you as well. Thank you.
Thank you, all of you. Matt, please come back too. I have lots of questions, and we've got good questions that have already come in from the group that's watching. So, but I have one that, as I was, listening and watching that, first of all, thank you for the work that you all are doing. It's very interesting in terms of how you're kind of merging technology with history and preservation and storytelling in a way and in a place that's been long gone for most people that have never experienced it. They know the story. And I guess a couple of things. One is you were talking, I think about like early in preservation, or not that long ago in preservation, like places like the Lower East Side Tenement House Museum. When they first got started, it was novel and creative in terms of they told the stories of the people that lived there, of different eras and different backgrounds, and it humanized it in a way that traditionally was never told, especially in preservation or interpretation, even for traditional house museums. And I like what you're doing in terms of, it's very interesting in terms of the technology of taking it even further. But I also think about when you think of Bunker Hill and the era in which it was lost, it's very early days of people even thinking about preservation. And, if we had more formal preservation in place, or the Conservancy or other groups, which we were not in existence then, would we have lost Bunker Hill? Who knows? But it was a moment in time that I think kicked off people starting to think about losing places that they cared about. But it also is interesting when you put Bunker Hill in context with a place like Chavez Ravine, pretty much the same era. And then even earlier, like Terminal Island with the Japanese American village there that was also completely displaced in the early 40s. What is it, I'm getting to the question, but what is it about these kinds of places that are lost that really connects with people even today? That fascinates people, that people want to know more about the story and the people and the place and the descendants. You know, you talked about that earlier, and that's the thing, that there are descendants attached to just these three examples that are all still very much connected to this place that's been long gone. So I'm just curious, maybe to kick us off in some of the questions. That's more philosophical, but I think it is something, especially about those three areas in LA, and there's probably others that have kind of have this story that is, you know, rooted in trauma and loss.
Yeah, I want to bring Liza Jane into this because I think she's got a really good perspective and can definitely talk about current preservation practice and that sort of thinking. Why Bunker Hill? Why it still resonates with so many of us? I think part of it is because the community actually, even though you displace and sort of fracture the geography, you don't actually fracture people's memories. And people do remember and they pass on those stories. And it lives, I think, in an LA consciousness that we're all still dealing with. And perhaps, you know, because it is almost the geographic center of LA. And so it is a hole right in the middle of the city, right? And it kind of lives on right there. And I do think there's a lot of parallels, of course, with how it connects to Chavez Ravine or Terminal Island or other urban renewal sites, in that at the time, the idea of the sort of economic engine of Bunker Hill is a story that I don't think is told, and it wasn't told at the time. The idea of workforce housing, that there are individuals who deserve to be in places that are close to jobs, that are close to their family, that are close in to metro and services and all these kind of infrastructure choices. I think we were thinking that we would all spread out. And I think one of the things that's changed now is we're really realizing that we've hit the edge, right? Sprawl has hit the wall, and we can't continue to go out, and we have to rethink about how we're still connected, and thinking about densification. So one of the things that has really struck me is this idea of shared housing. And so many of these houses were converted from single-family houses into sort of multiple dwelling units. And I think that is an interesting model that kind of resonates for me as a planner. And I also want to get Eliza's take on the sort of why these things continue as memory.
Yes, I usually preface my work or any space that I enter by saying I am the descendant of a lynching victim. And so that is a lens through much of my work, through the way in much of my work is done, right? And so this notion of understanding what we do not preserve speaks to as much as what we do preserve, right? And so these oral histories, these things we're looking into, these individuals who are seemingly lost in time or are just important as the buildings that we discuss in preservation. And I think this push now, not just to focus on the built environment, also to incorporate these lives, right? And also so that history does not, in effect, repeat itself. Our collective memories are what we as individuals hold, right? But that is not necessarily based upon history, which is based on facts and data, right? So in order to have these histories matter to all facets and to continue to be counted with any form of that validity, there is this empirical data that's necessary. And there's also, I think, for just the everyday little P preservationists, their interest in this is because there's a commonality, right? This is something that's happening every single day. Like people are being pushed from their homes, right? And so this resurgence makes you kind of think about what are the examples or what are the case studies that are relatable to what is occurring.
Yeah, that's actually, if I will pick up on that really quickly, I had a student yesterday ask me about the idea of social justice. And one of the things he said was perhaps with the idea of social justice, we focus too much on the social and not enough on the justice. And so if there's anything that perhaps we could learn from somewhere like Bunker Hill is that this is part of a long continuum. And as Eliza said, it continues. And so maybe the justice aspect of it is holding those who are responsible now accountable for not making the same mistakes. And so that might be one of the lessons going forward.
Yeah, I think that's a great jumping off point for something that we really wanted to take some time to explore, which are what are the implications for today? We're seeing displacement, obviously in a much different form, or maybe a slightly different form. And there are movements of resistance, as there were for Bunker Hill. And one thing that this project, and particularly the research of descendants, makes really clear is that there's always a ripple effect, right? It's not just one action that stops. People have to go somewhere. They continue their lives. They respond in really creative and resilient ways. And I think people today are really looking to the past for ideas about how they move forward. So I'm curious to hear about if there are strategies, if there are housing models, if there are policy solutions that you all in your research as historians, and particularly around planning, think are really relevant to connect Bunker Hill to these issues today.
I think for me, if I bring it back to this 1939 housing survey, so this was a survey that was done citywide. The Housing Authority had been founded only a couple of years before, and one of the things why they did this survey was the federal government said, we will give you money if you can prove to us that there are slums in Los Angeles. And so it almost was a self-fulfilling prophecy, because then what they did was they went out and found slums, and they sort of defined the data in a way to tell that particular story in order to qualify for federal funds. So if there are lessons for today, one of them is like, think about the biases that are in the data that's being collected right now. One of the decisions about whether a house was substandard at the time was based on shared bathrooms, right? Two families that share a bathroom, that house would automatically be determined to be substandard. And so one of the things, as we think about the housing that we have now, what are the definitions of quote unquote substandard, and what are the things that we actually want to build into improve the neighborhoods so that they don't have that kind of same overlay of sort of national level standards that are different from the way that people actually really use and live in housing and thrive in housing, right? So that's one option. Eliza?
I think that pretty much speaks to good idea. I think in regards to policy and advocacy, I always say like this can be utilized as a tool to create empathy and also increase one's knowledge about a region, a place, a space that you may not be familiar with, right? Reading it in text or seeing pictures in a book does not allow that same formal connection that is conveyed through this XR technology, right? It's a deeper lens, right? That's more engaging and creates a relatability that cannot be matched through just reading text. And so I think that makes it an adequate tool for policy advocacy in conjunction with recommendations.
And I want to bring Matt in as well too, because Matt has been really thinking about technology and how it speaks and how it tells stories. I know that's one of the things that you're really interested in. As Eliza and I are sort of the historians behind the scenes, but Matt's really taking a new form and kind of telling stories with it.
Yeah, at the very most basic level, I tell people I'm working on this project, and most of them, people have lived here forever, have no idea that Bunker Hill existed, and immediately they have this curiosity of what happened? Where do they go? Or why do they do that? And so like that's really important to take that like very natural curiosity and like turn that into the way that people can engage with this history and with these resources.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, I think one of the things about this in terms of visualizing Bunker Hill and just even the ability of, like Matt, as you were showing, flying over. I haven't seen Bunker Hill like that before. We all see the kind of seminal, pictures, and you go, what were they thinking, in terms of that? And you rarely see people. So I love that you're putting the side of the story of the people that live there. But I think, we always say in preservation, it's much harder to tell the story about a place if you can't touch it, feel it, see it, experience it, go inside it. It's less real, it's less tangible. And obviously, we don't have Bunker Hill anymore, but I think what you're doing is you're able to, bring an experience to a place that's been long gone and help people kind of navigate that, which I think is really powerful. Um, I want to shift to a question that maybe Lindsay kind of started a little bit, but I'd like to chew on it a little further. Is, if you just look at urban renewal across the country, traditionally it went into neighborhoods that were kind of the path of least resistance in terms of neighborhoods, the people, usually communities of color, renters, people that didn't have power to say no or to really stand up to what was being proposed and were pushed out. How do you see that in terms of, again, thinking about what's happening today with the push for housing, and we're increasingly seeing pressure more on a building by building perspective of, okay, we can increase density here, we could house more people, maybe not affordable housing, but more housing, and that pushes people out. But in terms of the same kind of power dynamic of renters, by and large, I guess you could, equate in some ways they don't have the power because they don't own, and they're always vulnerable to either increases or displacement or being pushed out in various forms. But I think that's a powerful connection again of like what Bunker Hill teaches us, but how it manifests itself today in terms of the quest for housing or the quest for progress. I mean, big capital words in terms of who defines it, but that's often what is driving this through policy or land use zoning.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things to me is that when we actually look at sort of the renter to who owned and Bunker Hill, but also who managed Bunker Hill, right? So this was a place where there were a lot of women and a lot of single women who owned these homes for over a long period of time, and they used the conversion of breaking these homes up into smaller pieces to maintain income, right? There were a lot of women who served as the managers of these, lived in these houses and kind of managed as landladies on behalf of other owners. So one of the things that I think about, and one of the things that I think we can sort of push forward is small scale, especially women owners. What kinds of things are we doing to keep elderly women in houses that perhaps they have a large home that they could possibly share with one other family? What are the kinds of things that we're doing to help people stay in the homes that they own and make those viable long term? Not all of us are going to be able to build an ADU in our backyards, but perhaps there's an extra bedroom that is not being used. And I know this isn't a policy large scale, but it is one way to think about keeping homeowners in the places where they deserve to be and they've sort of invested their lives, and bringing other people into the home that perhaps help share the rent. I mean, it is an interesting, the number of women who own property on Bunker Hill is really interesting. And those who manage those houses were also largely women.
And I want to say it was also interesting as we did the research how many people were involved in the military, and they were military families. And so when we think about this crisis of homeless veterans, I think this is a way we can look to begin to model this model of care and family Um, and like Meredith has said before, this may not be the model for everyone, right? But it is a model, right? Some form of solution to think moving forward.
Yeah, because I think one of the things that you would say, some of these Victorians now would be called SRO housing. They'd be called single room occupancy housing, and that's not the function that they served at the time. And the idea of single room housing, SRO housing, it's become sort of labeled in such a way that you can't actually bring up the conversation anymore. But this is, these were single rooms, but they were also networks of resiliency and care and connection and access to services, access to transit, access to jobs. I mean, all of those things came with living in dense central locations.
How do you see this project evolving, and where is it going? And I also have the question, like, how exactly did it start? What was the kernel that said we should do this? So if you could maybe share a little bit of that, and then maybe we are getting lots of good questions, so we probably should, we've got some good questions from the audience I want to make sure we get to as well.
So I'll keep it super short, how it started and where it's going. How it started was it started on a bus. It started with a conversation between Susie Norshut, who's a USC librarian, and myself on a bus as COVID happened. And one of the things I was thinking about is, what do historians do when all of the archives are closed? And so I was turning to digital sources. I was looking at, other things. USC had scanned versions of this 1939 survey. And I had known that this survey was available digitally, but because it was scanned as images, you couldn't actually get any of the data off it. So it really started almost as a transcription project, and I selected Bunker Hill because it's a nice contained square. You can kind of get 5,000, records and start your research there. But that just the transcription was not enough. And fortunately, we were able to collaborate with the USC Amundsen Lab. And that, I think, is when we really started to think about new technologies coming together with a kind of historical focus and a preservation focus to build something out. Where it's going, to be honest, it's going to take over my life for like the rest of my life. I mean, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and better and better. We are the survey itself, this 1939 survey, we are transcribing, and we will make that publicly available. So that data will be available to any researcher or sort of person who's interested in remixing that data long term. It will be a website. We've been working really hard to kind of squash it into the website format. So there will be a public-facing website that you can kind of interact with. We do have a VR model that we're still playing with. You put the goggles on, you can walk down the street and, interact with individuals on the street. All of these things take time, and they kind of grow. And as Matt said, it's iterative. It kind of ebbs and flows, and, we find new things to do. But we are also talking about the world didn't end at the boundaries of the CRA redevelopment site. How do you connect down to Grand Central? How do you connect to some of the jobs, downtown? Or the edges might start to blur a little bit and get bigger.
Well, speaking of edges, that's one of the questions that one of the folks is asking about. Do the boundaries of what was traditionally known as Bunker Hill, does that still correspond to what we know of Bunker Hill today?
I think what we're looking at today is mostly the Community Redevelopment Agency boundaries. I mean, the interesting thing about the hill, so the housing was developed, the people were displaced, but the hill was also removed. So what we're looking at when we think of Bunker Hill is not anywhere close to the hill that was actually there. And Bunker Hill obviously was also part of a series of hills. So there was Fort Moore Hill, there was Pound Cake Hill, there were hills that were demolished by the freeways that went through. So that whole geography is radically different. And for me, that is part of what I struggle with. It's hard to see in my mind, Bunker Hill, because it's so different. So, one of the things that we're building into the model is the topography. So you'll be able to realize just how steep and how, different it really was. So I think what we see on Bunker Hill today is the CRA Bunker Hill. It is not Bunker Hill of the 1940s, I would think.
And I just want to expand on that for one moment, because as we've talked about, our version of Bunker Hill is kind of flat, and it's kind of thematic, and it feels like a film. And when you get to see it in 3D and you get to see this actual land, right, that has been moved and reconfigured, it adds this whole other layer. So we're thinking about how people connect to their environments, not only their buildings, but the natural surroundings as well. I'm also hoping, Meredith, you can share the history of where that dirt went.
Yeah. So as part of our research, the people were displaced, the houses were demolished. The land that was Bunker Hill was also carted off. So it's significantly lower as a hill than it was. That land was used as filler for the 710 freeway on-ramps. So the land of Bunker Hill literally facilitated the spread of Los Angeles as a region. So it was one of those sort of facts that when we found it, just kind of opened up our eyes to all sorts of new possibilities. The people of this area funded the sort of economic engine of downtown and the region. When they were displaced, those who had means very often moved to kind of suburbs. So we've been tracing where people went. So a lot of people went to Pico Rivera, a lot of people went to Glendale. There were kind of networks who moved to this kind of small suburbs, small houses in suburbs. But the land itself was also moved out to facilitate LA's spread.
You talked, Liza Jane, you talked a little bit more about descendants. Can you share more about like how you've connected with descendants specifically at Bunker Hill? And, obviously that wasn't an easy process to do that, but also just be curious, like how has that manifested itself in terms of part of this work?
I want to say first, I didn't speak with any directly. One of our classmates did find a person and they were emailed. I know a couple of folks have reached out to Meredith via various channels, and then they email her through the website. And so the individuals that I have been in contact with are the actual ancestry documents, um, which I have reached out to people, but this is a sensitive topic. Like we talk about it so easily as researchers, and that's why it's so key and essential as preservationists that the same care that we embed towards, buildings, and making sure that we think before we act is the same way we engage with, in effect, you know, coming in contact with the people who may be descendants of Bunker Hill. Um, and I want to note, just to piggyback on two of these questions that are in the chat, if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
There was one that said, are there any other places that maybe in danger of redevelopment and blah blah blah? I can speak to Lamert Park, right? Because I saw someone saying something about attending community meetings with the CRA was still around. There's a redeveloping push for Crenshaw. And just this idea about language, the today with planning language, those meetings are secretive because residents don't understand ordinary words, right? And I think that's why this project is so essential, because it opens that gateway where you might not understand the language, but the visuals speak to you, right? And it's this way of breaking down the barriers of making this exclusivity that exists in our field no longer there. And I'm a champion for this particular model. I want to see it all across the country. I tell Professor Meredith all the time, because I'm from a rural region and I see the validity for a tool like this when we think about Tulsa, That's my example. I'm on my soapbox about that because it's in the media right now, and there's nothing we can do but imagine if those judges who keep reviewing this information were able to see the visual of the place that was demolished, that was known as Greenwood, um, at that time, see it present day in real time, right? And then be able to build out the identities of the persons who inhabited those buildings, right? Through research like this. And so that's why this model, I really see it being a tool of advocacy, long term. I'm excited that I was even able to be engaged with it because I learned a lot. And I think there's a lot we can all learn from it.
Thank you. And I'm just seeing all these amazing questions in the chat. I wonder how we're going to be able to answer all of this. But um, if there's one, if I could leave you with, we do have a website. So bunkerhillrefrain.org, right, Matt? Am I getting that right?
It is.
Yeah, right. Um, and as we are progressing, we're posting information there. We will have the survey data available there as soon as we can get it slightly cleaned up. We will have more descendant stories there. There also is a contact page where if you feel comfortable and you want to reach out to us, please do. And that goes via email. Um, there's so I want to like keep this chat open. Lindsay, Adrian, how could we respond to some of these?
We can, we can do our best.
Yeah.
I think we can we've got 2 minutes, so let's see if we can get a few more in here. I think one, I think is really quick that we can answer, and I think this is part of like, there's a bit of legend lore existing around Bunker Hill, like what was kept, what was moved from Bunker Hill, so maybe we can clear that up. And like, is Heritage Square, does that contain anything from Bunker Hill? And obviously it's sort of a complicated sort of yes, no.
Yeah, exactly. It's a yes, no question. So the last two Victorians on Bunker Hill were moved to Heritage Square. So the castle, which was 325 South Bunker Hill, and the Salt Box, both owned by members of the Pattison family. They were moved to Heritage Square and they were designated cultural heritage monuments. Within a year of moving to Heritage Square, they actually burned in an arson fire. So neither of those two structures remain. So there isn't actually anything of Bunker Hill in Heritage Square. Lindsay did let us know a couple of days ago there were some houses that were moved for what would have been the 4th Street cut, which was before the Community Redevelopment Agency, but it was the extension of the freeway. Some houses were moved from Bunker Hill, and Lindsay has promised me that we'll actually go check some of those out. But what's existing today on Bunker Hill, the only remnant that's there is a fragment of a wall at 4th Street. And that is the last physical thing that is on Bunker Hill from before urban renewal. But there isn't anything at Heritage Square that is actually from Bunker Hill. Those things, the things that are there come from a lot of different places, Bunker Hill adjacent included.
Do you consider Angel's Flight?
I guess, well, it's moved, so yeah. It's not in its original location.
Right.
So yes, Angel's Flight. Angel's Flight is there.
Okay. The other one maybe we can get to at the very end here is, and multiple people asked this question about like Bunker Hill and noir, film of that era, like why was that happening and how, I don't know if you've been able to uncover more of that story, because certainly it was a backdrop for lots of films.
It was, and if you haven't done so yet, read Nathan Masters' book because that gives a really great. And there's a lot of books on Jim Dawson's book on Bunker Hill and noir. There's a lot of really great work out there on Bunker Hill and noir. Why Bunker Hill? I think it was because it was perceived as in decline and easy for film permits. It was a very urban place, and LA maybe didn't have quite the same urban feel. that other places might have done in the 1940s. So if you were looking for urban in the 1940s, Bunker Hill was it. If any of you have seen some of the footage from the 40s, for me, it always looks like San Francisco. You know, it's very dense. It's very interesting neighborhood. For me, we have deliberately not engaged with the noir, because one of the things that I think is important for us to remember is that it was a living, vibrant community that existed outside of the film industry. And that's the neighborhood that I think I am really connected to. I want to really acknowledge that these were everyday people living ordinary lives, and they weren't a backdrop for Hollywood. They were like working in cafes. They were running, the Department of Water and Power. I mean, they were the people who made LA work. And that is the community that I really think doesn't get a lot of airtime, because they weren't on the Hollywood set. But I still love all the film noir. I mean, that's definitely how I got into it. But yeah, love it, but it's film.
Yeah. Well, all good things must come to an end.
This
Unfortunately,
went
we're
by
out
so
of
fast.
time. Thank you all, and thank you for all the work you're doing on Bunker Hill Refrain. Again, bunkerhillrefrain.org. So go to the website, check it out. It's amazing. Easy to get lost. And we look forward to what's the next version. I know it's your entire life going forward, Meredith.
Absolutely. Like everything else. Yeah.
But it's really worthwhile, and it's great in terms of shining the light and telling more of the full color and feel and sense of the people and the story of this place. So I really appreciate what you're doing here. Again, thank you. And all of you that tuned in today, appreciate it. And again, we'll be back on November 12th for a People Plus Places looking at Judson Studios. Again, trying to tell a fuller, bigger story about also kind of an iconic, legendary legacy business. And so we look forward to seeing you there. And again, thanks everyone for taking part in this. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.